Welcome to this afternoon's public lecture on transnational student mobility. Good afternoon, good evening from the East Coast, and good morning from Asia. My name is Min Zhou. I am Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies, the Walter and Shelley Wang Endowed Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications, and Director of the Asia Pacific Center at UCLA. Today's webinar is hosted by the UCLA Asia Pacific Center and co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for the Study of International Migration. Both centers are among the 27 interdisciplinary research centers and programs within UCLA's International Institute. Today's lecture is presented in conjunction with the UCLA Upper Division course, Sociology 180A, Asia Community, Cross-Border, Border Crossing, Diasporic Formation, and Social Transformation in Asia. The event is made possible by a grant from the Eurasia Foundation in Asia. I thank Eurasia Foundation for their generous support. I also thank my staff at the Asia Pacific Center and the Center for the Study of International Migration for their administrative and technical assistance. Now, a few words about our center. The UCLA Asia Pacific Center promotes greater knowledge and understanding of Asia and the Pacific region on campus and in our community through innovative research, teaching, public programs, and international collaborations. We focus on inter-Asian and trans-Pacific connections from historical, contemporary, and comparative perspectives, and encourage interdisciplinary work on cross-border and supranational issues on language and culture, politics, economy, and society, and the sustainability in the ongoing processes of globalization. Our center runs the program on Central Asia, Taiwan Studies Program, and Hong Kong Studies Program. We are also an academic partner of the Global Chinese Philanthropy Initiative. And we are leading now a new Pacific World Research Initiative on Asians in Latin America and Latin Americans in Asia. That is a collaborative project with UCLA Latin American Institute. Now, please keep yourself muted at all times. If you have questions and comments, please write them down very briefly on the Q&A box. After the presentation, I will select your questions for Professor Liu Farah. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gracia Liu Farah. Dr. Gracia Liu Farah is Professor of Sociology at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies and the Director of the Institute of Asian Migrations at Waseda University, Japan. She conducts research on cross-border migration and social mobility in Asia with a focus on the mobilities of students and professional workers. She also examines the relationship between global labor mobility and national employment systems in Japan, Germany, and the UK. Professor Farah has published widely in the areas of migration, including 2 recent books, Routledge Handbook of Asian Migrations, published in 2018, and Immigrant Japan, Mobility and Belonging in an Ethno-Nationalist Society, published recently in 2020. Professor Farah, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhou, for your kind introduction and also invitation to speak to students from all over the world here. So today, I think I'm going to talk about transnational student mobility, and I'm going to start sharing. Second. Okay, I hope this is okay. Everybody can see the screen. All right. So basically, yeah, I have been studying student mobilities since my graduate school research. And it's a topic dear to my heart. I recently have returned to this topic. So I would like to kind of give you some sort of overview of the field and what has been developing, especially in the Asian context. Okay, so first of all, this is a picture of Dr. Li Yuanzhe. You probably wonder why I would introduce Professor Li Yuanzhe. He is a chemist, is a Nobel Prize winning chemist. And he is Taiwanese American, and I think he regained Taiwanese citizenship, and I think renounced his American citizenship. But the reason why I mentioned him is because I actually met him at a conference in 2005. We went to this conference in global mobilities in Japan, and he was a keynote speaker. So I had a great fortune to sit beside him. So we had a chat. And the reason why he was there was because he was talking about his own experience of mobilities. And one thing that struck me, he talked a lot, he was really concerned about global warming and energy sources, but he also talked about his own experience as an international student from Taiwan to the United States in the 1960s. One thing that struck me was that he said in 1960s, when he was going off to the US, his parents used their lifetime saving to get a one-way ticket for him to go to the United States. So at the airport, they were hugging and they were all crying because the parents thought that was the last time they would ever see him. And lo and behold, he made a distinguished career in the United States and returned to Taiwan to be a key scientist over there. And he's still leading the scientific research in Taiwan. So what I try to say is this generation of international students, I think this is a kind of it's a really typical image of very successful international student from Asia to North America, and who were basically at that time didn't think there would be a transnational mobility at all. They were thinking that's the lifetime decision, you know, that's once for all. And I think when Professor Zhou and I studied in North America at the very beginning, I think we didn't think we could actually return to our home country probably that easily or that quickly either. But things have changed. So from 20th century, especially post-war 20th century to 21st century, a lot of things about student mobilities have changed. So this is the reason I put up this photo. So one big change, obviously, is a rapid expansion of international education. This is a graph from OECD Library as a trend of actually 21 years from 1998 to 2018. You can see the population of international tertiary students have increased by more than 100%. And it's particularly the expansion of a non-OECD country, in the recent years are quite significant. So we know that a lot of the countries that are not in OECD country have been destinations for international students are, say, China, Russia, Malaysia, Singapore, United Arab UAE, Emirates, and including, say, Botswana, Qatar. These are all new emergent destinations for international education. And but students from Asia form the largest group of international or foreign students in tertiary education at all levels, accounting for 57% of all mobile students across OECD in 2018. together, the People's Republic of China and India contribute more than 30% of all mobile students enrolled in OECD countries. So for the OECD countries, Indians and Chinese students were almost 1/3. And without surprise, United States is still the top OECD country, OECD destination for international students. It's still the world leader in international education, and actually accounts for 18% of a global education market share in 2018. So it's very significant, followed by Australia, United Kingdom, and Germany. However, here, this is a graph of tertiary education. In recent decades, actually, the faces of international students have changed rapidly. A large number of international students are not counted in the statistics. So I think today what we are going to do is look at different types of students who are transnationally mobile. So what are the different phases of international students? First of all, the largest and the most significant and the most relevant to us, a lot of us have been or are international students, is the global trotting university students. And first, basically, as we have all experienced, there is this rising emphasis on academic credentials all over the world, and especially during the post-war decades. And so in a lot of countries, without higher education, it's impossible to get white-collar jobs anymore. And in some East Asian countries, actually, without a graduate degree, you cannot get a desirable job. So this sort of weight of a credential has forced a lot of students to look for education opportunities, if not within the country, outside of country. The second significant reason that we can see a lot of global trotting students are the actually world ranking system. This is actually a relatively new system, world ranking, starting from late 20th century, but has taken over a lot of people's, especially nation states and individuals and organizations, businesses, really the kind of talent consciousness. So you have to rank at a certain level in order to, if you want to have a good job, you have to go to a university ranked globally at a certain level. And that sort of a situation has, increased the pressure for students to go outside of their country to be enrolled in more competitive university, highly ranked universities. Because sometimes, if you, for example, in China, there are really excellent domestic universities. Those students probably can get good jobs, but not all students can get into top ranking Chinese universities. So it's relatively easier, actually, if you're willing to pay for the cost, can go to a world, top 500, top 300 university outside of China. It's less competitive, and still it has a very good market potential employability. So this is another reason. And also with the globalization, I think a lot of employers value foreign languages, especially English. So if you go overseas, in fact, you at least bring back this sort of language skills as an incentive. And also increasingly, actually, international education is very organized. I think most universities nowadays have a lot of exchange programs with other institutions all over the world. It becomes one of the signal of their globalized orientations. And also we have, like in Europe, we have Erasmus Mundus, and in Asia, you have like Campus Asia, or you have ASEAN countries, you have different kinds of programs. Try to circulate students, try to make students move. And because international student mobility education has become a kind of important signal of not only the excellence of the institution, and also the excellence of the individuals. So this is very organized. And we also see this very commercialized tendency of, the reality of international education. In fact, it is a market. Countries use international education to support their own institutions, because international students tend to pay for fees, and sometimes, several times higher than the local fees. So UK, Australia, and the United States included, use international education, see international education as a business. And in fact, a lot of universities use brokers to recruit students, and the brokers will have a kickback by sending students over there. So this sort of commercialization of education also feeds the growth of the migration industry. On the slide on the right-hand side, the bottom right, was a picture I took, a photo I took in Shanghai. That was several years ago when people were still mobile. That was a photo taken in the Grand Hyatt. And they occupied 3 floors of conference venues in that Grand Hyatt in Pudong. And it was done by a New Orient. Xin Dongfang is one of the biggest education consultancy firm. It's international education fair. And here is American undergraduate program, or going to UK. In fact, that fair has, you name it, all European countries, North American countries. As Japan, on the other hand, there's like one little desk. I guess Japan has become as less of this kind of a market. And so these are the pictures. It's not very well organized, but you can see it's the left-hand side here is the bottom left corner of the photos here is about how Chinese labor market, Chinese students have trouble actually in 2016 is earlier. A lot of pressure, a lot of kind of tight labor market for graduates of higher education institutions. So we see a lot of, for example, Chinese students who study graduate programs overseas. Of course, as I said, international students are not limited to tertiary education. A lot of them start early. Here I have an article, and it's just a kind of truncated here. It's by Professor Meng Zhou and written in 1998. At that time, she was already talking about parachute kids, how some Asian families, just parachute their kids into California, Orange County, and those kids homestay there and try to try to learn English early, try to get into a kind of universities in the United States, so parachute kids were kind of started in 1990s. I think a lot of East Asian families try to send their children to, especially North America and sometimes Australia, some English-speaking country mostly, so that their kids can have a head start. And also out of this, white geese families are kind of Korean metaphor for such families. So the kids go, and usually accompanied by mother. These children will go to different kinds of English-speaking countries depending on how much money you have. Many of them end up in Singapore, even the Philippines. So in order for the children to learn English early. And so we can see a lot of these trends. I think here I just want to mention that this sort of trend has a lot to do with the instability and insecurity of the middle class, in especially East Asia, and not just East Asia, because some of this sort of phenomenon are also observed, for example, in Kazakhstan. Some middle class family try to use education as a way to, ensure the students' future. And also, good higher education institution with good standing is the only path that parents see that, the children might have relatively affluent and comfortable lifestyle. This costs a lot. I'm talking about it costs a lot because I was so fascinated by parents' devotion to children's education. For example, in context of China, a lot of families started when children were in middle school. So they have an education consultant, basically helping the child, tailoring the child's education trajectories from very early on. We're talking about, it costs hundreds of thousands US dollars, the whole process. And one parent told me there's no receipt for that. So it's just money you just, throw into the bucket. And I asked her, why did you spend so much money? Because, it's not like the children are making huge amount of income. And it seems like if you spend 1 million renminbi, in this education, how long does the child to actually to get the returns on their investment? But this mother was telling me, they're just so afraid that children will sink to the bottom of the society. And she said, if there is a kind of guarantee that my child could get into a comfortable middle-class situation, such as working in the office at Jack Ma's company, at that time it's Alibaba, is a very, very, big and desirable employer, I wouldn't be worried so much. So basically, it was a lot of insecurity and also the kind of a class instability, and it prompts parents to try to invest in children's education, especially in Asia. Sorry. And the last one here, early study abroad students, I include transnational students. By this, I think it sounds vague. I try to kind of describe those immigrant children who actually were sometimes born in the destination countries, but the parents will send them back to their home country in order to learn the language, in order to be disciplined, to be culturally conditioned into a desirable person that the parents see. And sometimes the parents are worried that the children will be contaminated by this Western culture. There's some literature on this trend, like parents use home country education as a tool to instill the kind of traditional values in children. So we see that quite a bit in different countries. In Japan, parents mostly consider, for example, especially Chinese parents will consider children, and Chinese is a very useful cultural, human capital for the children's future. So they want to make sure children actually get good Chinese learning. So they will send children back to China to stay for a couple of years, sometimes throughout elementary school. And African families send their children to, in UK, for example, send their children back to Africa to be disciplined, to be culturally retrained. So these are the early study abroad students. The third type of students I want to mention here are the student workers. This is actually a phenomenon I studied a lot when I started my research among Chinese students in Japan, because that was such a prevalent phenomenon. Everybody worked. The reason why students were able to go to Japan because Japan allowed students to work. And I later on realized that it's not just Japan, most of the countries other than the US. US, you can only work on campus, but most other international education destinations, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Germany, all allow students to work outside campus. And depending on, sometimes 16 hours, sometimes 20, sometimes 28 hours a week in Japan. And during vacations, you can even work more. So that actually, in reality, incentivizes a lot of people to use education channel as a labor migration channel. And sometimes this sort of a differentiation, that dual identity is quite, vague. A lot of students obviously are thinking of pursuing education and changing education opportunity, but there are also some students just eyeing at the cash that they can possibly gain by working on low-wage jobs. And these are actually the education I studied toward Japan, like bound to Japan. On the left-hand side here is a report on the reality. The Vietnamese students were told by the brokers that they would be making 1,500 to 2,500 USDs if they go to Japan to study. And on the right-hand side is actually it's a Japanese international student support organization. They tell you that actually 100% we can guarantee your part-time jobs. So you can see that first of all, this sort of a channel actually gives a lot of leeway, a lot of market to migration industry, and that's what we see. And also because a lot of countries, such as Japan or other places, your language is not English. And also in Australia and New Zealand, actually language academies are very major vessels of international education. So a lot of students come here to learn language first. And so the threshold for international education is very low. And so a lot of brokers, intermediate, even language schools will collaborate with a lot of brokers to channel these students. So it really makes the migration industry omnipresent organization or a functioning unit in the whole process. And also the low-wage labor not only allows students to pursue education, and for a country like Japan, and actually many countries with a population, kind of structural change, like with the reduction of young people, they really look for low-wage laborers, and international students fill this niche. Actually, at one conference, when I was asked the question why, students will become low-wage labor, and I just asked them, look around you and think of your own past. Have you ever done low-wage part-time jobs? As students have been traditionally a part of the low-wage labor force all over the advanced economies, I will say, in the United States, college students and high school students, and working at restaurants and etc. So when this population is reduced, obviously you want to bring from overseas. So it is the student function as the low wage labor is not just for international students, but also for the domestic students. So these are different types of students that we actually can see. I'm sure you can identify more, and this is some new research area you probably can just explore. The next I want to talk about is the patterns of mobilities. So from educationally channeled international migration to different temporalities and directions. So as I showed you, Dr. Lee was from Taiwan to United States. And like from this sort of, from East Asia, from Africa, from Latin America to North America to former former kind of imperial colonial masters kind of countries, a very common kind of phenomenon in the post-war decades. And a lot of students actually migrate in order to stay. But we see actually different kinds of temporality. Temporality means either longer or shorter, or is very now vary, and also directions vary. So still, international education is an important pathway into immigration. To be an immigrant in the destination country, and this we see in North America, in Australia, students try to stay, right? And this is oftentimes, this at least kind of intention of many students. And because most states in the kind of globalizing knowledge economy are wooing and courting international students and hoping them to retain in the labor market upon graduation. International students have a lot of advantages because they learn the language during universities and during colleges, and they're also trained in particular trade, or at least they have more cultural knowledge. So they are desirable skilled migrants. This is still a very important path for international students. And this traditionally fueled the discourse of brain drain. A lot of international students stayed in the destination countries, and because they came from oftentimes developing countries, so they left developing country void of talents. So this brain drain discourse was kind of consequence of this traditional way of international education and immigration. Obviously, now we see brain circulation, like what Dr. Lee's example exemplified. He was able to go back to Taiwan and became a head of Taiwan Synagogue and play an important role in developing the science scene in Taiwan, and also in many countries, India, in China, and Taiwan, Israel. A lot of those high-tech companies were established by returned migrants from Silicon Valley. So you do have this sort of brain kind of circulation. And we see that actually, especially from the late 20th century and early 21st century, you see this return of a lot of more transnational kind of student mobility. And also we see from primarily south to north, the developing countries to more developed countries, to different directions. Right now, as I mentioned in the graph, for example, China and Russia have all become important destinations for international migration. In fact, China, I think, had 500,000 students, international students, studying in their institutions. So the directions have become much more varied. So you can see from this graph, right? I don't know, I will explain. So here you can see the legends, the biggest group from the left to right. Here, Asians. You can see Japan is mostly Asian, Korea is mostly Asian. The percentage of actually the ratio of the Asian students. Australia, mostly Asian, Indonesia, mostly Asian, and New Zealand, all these places, mostly Russian federations, mostly Asian. A lot of Chinese students in Russia, and also from other Central Asia, actually Asian country, former Soviet Union countries. And you can hear on the right-hand side is another extreme, as the South America, Latin America and Caribbean students. They're mostly concentrated in Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia. So you can see there is this, and also in the middle, the green, light green area, all European students. So European students kind of stretch out a bit more, but they also concentrate a lot in Europe. So we see the kind of phenomenon of intra-regional mobilities. This is actually relatively new. They start in late 20th century with other Erasmus Mundus, and with different kinds of, as I mentioned, organized education programs, and also recruiting efforts. People target particular countries for recruitment, and also students themselves. Actually, now they make different calculations. The purpose of international education change. They probably want to go to a culturally attractive place. So that makes, for example, Japan and Korea attractive to a lot of students. And some students understand actually a lot of students are from, say, China and East Asia, and they want to go to a country that's nearby, especially if they're the only children their only child in the family. They want to, the parents don't want the child to leave, to go too far. And as a geographic proximity actually plays a role. And European students, obviously, because Erasmus Mundus is all free, you can flow, and a labor market is also within Europe. So it's a lot of this sort of labor market dynamic is also there. So there are different reasons people move, and we do see this intra-regional mobilities more. And also, we see, especially in the 21st century, we see increasing returns. OECD has statistics. I think it's until I think it's 2000. Wait a second. Yes, according it's older statistics. According to OECD 2011 statistics, only around 20% of international graduates remain in the host labor market upon graduation. We're talking about OECD in all, so different countries vary, but on average, it's about 20% in 2011. Part of the reason is because a lot of countries, nation states, aggressively recruit their students back to their countries. Here is a Chinese case. I mean, China is probably the most aggressive recruiter of their students. In China, the overseas returnees are called haigui. And so they set up different kinds of zones, like developmental zones, industrial park, just to accommodate them, giving them all kinds of tax breaks, incentives to go back, even government grants to go back to China. And on the right-hand side, here is actually Shanghai. I mean, for those of you who can read Chinese, you know what this is. In China, one important institutional constraint for people's mobility is hukou, is a household registration. It used to be very, very difficult to move geographically if you don't have your household registration be kind of reassigned to another place. And obviously in China, big cities on the coast or in capitals such as Beijing and Shanghai are very attractive destinations for internal mobilities. And here is Shanghai Human Resource and Social Security Bureau, which is in charge of household registration kind of regulation. It really says here, the second line here, wait a second. Okay, here, third. So this is the policy toward returnees. So if you, for example, graduate from in China 211 and above kind of university, more kind of top tier universities, you can have this kind of you can actually apply for Shanghai's household registration. But if you have also world top 500 degrees, you also have the advantage when you find job in Shanghai, you can actually get Shanghai household registration. And you can see, the municipal government is offering all these incentives to attract international students back. And because of this, I have observed an interesting phenomenon. Students went out, to study in order to, I call it going west in order to go east, because there are a lot of Chinese students who went to university or grew up in the inland area of China, had a very little opportunity, especially those people who went to non-211 or, kind of elite universities. They have trouble finding jobs in coastal big cities. So they will now go to, say, UK to get a master's degree for 9 months or 10 months. And then with that degree, they could more easily get a job in places like Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing because of the incentives that municipal government offer. And I said, well, you spend a lot of money to go to UK. And they said, well, if you calculate, in the end, getting a household registration in Shanghai would otherwise cost more, than getting a degree, paying a UK degree. So you have this sort of different kinds of return situations because home countries offer a lot of incentives. But with the return is interesting because they don't return to their home regions. Usually they just go from, say, inland to a coastal town. So I call them like J-turns, right? Is usually people who end up in Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangdong are not those people who were born and grew up there. Okay, this is differentiated return. And Professor Zhou asked me to explain a little bit what affects the intention and the outcomes of stay and return. I recommend you probably could look up these 3 articles, two of them by Zweig, and David Zweig has been doing this overseas, especially Chinese students and return for a couple of decades. And recently I wrote an article with Brenda Yeo and Michael Bass in Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies to talk about the social construction of skill. So what do I want to say? What affects the intention of outcome of stay and return? Largely, a lot of international students, especially those who graduate from higher education institutions, have at least have tried to look for jobs in the destination countries, or at least tested, or they try to get information about that. But the difficulty of this is that the host labor market oftentimes has a set of institutional hurdles to recognize your skills, and a lot of and also cultural expectations and different kinds of hurdles for international students to enter that kind of job market. For example, people will evaluate your language skills, will evaluate your professional skills. So this is a big issue actually in so-called highly skilled migration, because you think with your human capital degree, you can actually do the equivalent jobs. So when you go to the other market, because that market says they need this sort of credentials, but when you end up there, you find that your previous credentials are not useful. Or even if you're an international student, sometimes some companies, corporate culture, it's a very alien to you. You do not have the cultural capital actually to enter that kind of job market. And in Germany case, actually also a lot of social capital. Germany, I studied German's school to work transition. German higher education is so specifically defined. You have to, if you want to be engineer in a German firm, you have not only to do the engineering degree and engineering courses, you have to specify which engineering that you are in. And you have to have so-called a practicum, which is internship in a specific area. Then you will get into specific kind of occupational niche. All that is a very, very constraining. And in Japan, obviously, they want everybody to speak fluent business level Japanese, which is quite difficult for a lot of even international students. So in the skills evaluation and recognition is a very big issue in students entering the host labor market. And then the 2 articles here shows how nation states, and the first one, do overseas returnees excel in the Chinese labor market? As the recent article, these authors discovered that returned Chinese graduate students earn 20% more compared to locally graduate students. And we're talking about graduate, is a post-undergraduates, a master's or PhD. Undergraduates actually don't have a significant difference. So you do see a kind of premium, right, on overseas degree. And the next article, actually, Zweig and his colleagues analyzed the situation in China and India and analyzed the role of state. And they found out that, in fact, the national and the local policies facilitate the returned entrepreneurs, returned entrepreneurship, returnees entrepreneurship in China. And but it doesn't matter or hinders in India. So the Chinese policy, in a sense, is more conducive to returnees, entrepreneurial endeavor, especially local governments aggressively recruit them, try to give them amenities and tax breaks, all kinds of incentives. But in India, it's less so. National government wants to attract them, but the local governments have very, very little resource. And oftentimes they become kind of, they ask for briberies and make things difficult for them. So Indian returnees find it it's more troublesome actually to start up in India. So this, if you're interested in this sort of issues, I recommend that you look into this literature. So the last pattern I'm going to mention here is the fluid and multiple mobilities. So first of all, I think we no longer just go from one place to the other. I think for students who have been studying international migration, transnationalism or mobility literature, right? The framework of migration has changed. How we see migration has changed. As the similar change takes place among international students, and more so because migration literature has indicated that highly skilled or people who have more human capital are more likely to be mobile. So what we see here is that there's multiple mobilities taking place. So first of all, a lot of, for example, scholars who study immigration into Singapore or Malaysia notice that like a lot of them will go there to study with aim of going to other countries. So using that as stepping stone to go somewhere else. So a lot of people say, I want to accumulate this and that. People do go to different countries, different destinations for education nowadays. Sometimes because education itself has changed, right? You have exchange programs, you have degree programs. So you can do all kinds of language academies, you can do all kinds of education, have assemblage of international education. What actually intrigued me recently, because I teach at a graduate school in Japan, and in the starting from actually 21st century, and especially the recent 10 years, I saw increasing Chinese students who graduate from the US institutions and apply for graduate school at Waseda. And I was thinking, oh gosh, why are they coming? If they already spend so much money, because we understand it's very expensive. The parents spend a lot of money on children's education to send them to the US. Why do you want to come to Japan? And so one of my master's students actually did research, because a lot of Chinese students, while in the US, felt they couldn't fit in. I think especially for more affluent middle-class Chinese students, they don't expect the kind of racism or the kind of a cultural stress that they would confront in the United States. But some of them also are interested in Japanese popular culture. And many of them actually majored in Asian studies and Japanese studies. And also sometimes you have to learn a foreign language, and they will learn Japanese because they feel it's easier. So a lot of these students are now coming to Japan. And also Japan, as a state policy, are actually encouraging international education. So they have started a lot of English medium education programs. This allowed, English, the Chinese students who went to English-speaking countries to study in a graduate school like mine. And also Australian students, many Australian students also come, UK students also come at a different graduate level. So this is a kind of quite interesting phenomenon that I have observed. This sort of detour education is also taking place, and students finally figure out what they want to do. And also because Japan's labor market is quite attractive to a lot of Chinese students. They're talking about, oh, there are a lot of and evolution in their own home country, so they wanted to go to Japan. Seems like it's much more organized and more stable. And the second is the fluidity I try to mention is that the mobility is very contingent and indeterminate. So students sometimes will wonder, you're young, right? And also you look at opportunities, so where would opportunities lead you? So there isn't this particular pattern for where to go. And students really are willing to go to different places. And the other phenomenon is the permanent residency for flexibility. This is Michael Bass' study of Indian students in Australia. What he found out is a lot of Indian students stay in Australia in order to get a permanent residence so that they could move around. So it's like insurance of residency, then I can be footloose. So this sort of fluid mobility is quite common. And the last item here I want to introduce is river of many returns. They have it's not like students will leave and will not come, because students have these sort of transnational cultural capital. We oftentimes see they will continuously use their transnational capital in the transnational economy. So a lot of them come and go, and come and go to different places. So what I try to emphasize here is the kind of more fluidity and multiple kind of mobilities that I have observed, and also a lot of researchers have observed in the recent decades. Okay, so I just come to the conclusion. The conclusion is that, first of all, it's very simple. International student mobility is increasing in volume, types, and patterns of mobility, as I have introduced. And the other point I want to emphasize is really international education is not individual choices anymore. It's not a family choices anymore. Rather, international education has become very institutionalized behavior, and there you have established migration infrastructure that moves students across borders. And that infrastructure includes the state, includes universities, include the labor market, employers, include social networks. And so all these, components of the infrastructure work together to move students across borders. And in this infrastructure, you see that international education, in fact, is a business. So you see the commercialization of international education and the very prominent role of the education migration industry. I just want to use this very simple figure to graph to show you. This on the left-hand side, the green and the maroon bars are Vietnamese and Nepalese students. The gray bars are Chinese. You can see before 2012, very few Vietnamese students or Nepalese students. Before 2004, you don't hardly see any of them. And with the migration industry brokers' effort, you can see such drastic increase of students. In fact, right now, the Vietnamese students have become a #1 language student population in Japan. And within the recent 5 years, their population increased by 10 times. And in the Vietnamese population in general in Japan has become #2 foreign resident population. It just took place so quickly. And I am not exaggerating to say that it's largely driven by the migration industry and education migration industry. It's a syndicate. And, Japan needs labor and they need profit, language schools need students, and all these things work together to drive this trend. So I think I'll just stop here. I have a couple of discussion questions. I don't know if you want to get into it, but I would really like you to ask me some questions about what I have presented. So the discussion question, obviously, the one is really in this international education, to what degree it has anything to do with that, global or domestic inequality. And do you see international education as a viable tool for equalizing socioeconomic gap or as a way that aggravates social inequality? The other is international education has changed dramatically since COVID-19 pandemic started. We are online, right? Now I'm giving you a lecture from Japan. So how do you think, into the international student mobility will actually change in the long run? So these are the questions, maybe food for thought for future. So I will just stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a very informative and stimulating lecture. And so we have time for Q&A. And before I open up to the questions posed by the audience, I have a few questions that I want to ask. You have already shed light into on a few of the concepts that we have discussed in our class with students. So one is the stepwise migration. And we all know that stepwise migration involves time and space, across time and space, right? And it's common to all international migrants. Now, what's unique about that stepwise migration pertaining to highly skilled migrants and student migrants? So that's one question. And the other related question is really about the legal path to both to migration. You talk a lot about how the education migration industry drives students, right, through legal means to migration. But what about the legal path for resettlement, especially in the Asian, a lot of the Asian countries, the receiving countries, they are having restrictive regime. And in Japan, last week we hear a guest lecture on the side door policy of Japan to deal with the greater need, labor market demand for workers. So could you address these two questions a bit more in depth?
Thank you. So first of all, stepwise migration, I think currently has been mostly applied to, say, domestic workers and migrant laborers, right? So emphasize how they actually, the agencies of migrants, they try to kind of maneuver this terrain, try to get better, employment situation, and they strategically go from one place to another. I think Andrew Paul and kind of coined the phrase, the stepwise migration. In higher education, I think that's actually much easier because, educational institution, because the international education has been a policy embraced by most universities and most national governments. And so and also, as I mentioned, because of all the existing infrastructure, channel, allowing students to move, exchange programs, on regional programs, and I think this sort of multiple mobility is more possible. But stepwise in higher education is not necessarily, among the international students, not necessarily is like always going upward. Rather, it's about looking for, it's a self-actualization, what they really want to do. And sometimes, I see students who come to Japan and later on they're interested in international relations, they want to go to Switzerland, for example. And so as young people have, as expanding kind of horizon upon international education, that when they first enter, then the horizon expands, and they look for next step, and also because of the education market is present, and it's much easier for them to step to the other, and so it's not necessarily upward. It could be just their, developing aspirations. Sometimes, when they become adult, they have more thoughts about what they want to do for their life. So that's why, some people who have already been in the US, they could stay in the US, but they want to come to, say, Japan instead, just because they feel like Japanese lifestyle culture is more desirable to them. Or so we see that not as kind of upward kind of a trend, rather much more diverse. Now, obviously, you do have the kind of upward trend that take place in, say, some countries like in education hubs, like in Singapore or Malaysia. People go there and then want to go to, say, Australia and the United States. You have that kind of steps as well, because the better standing in the university is, the more employable you will become. So you do see different trends in stepwise student mobilities. And so I don't know if I answered this question. The second is the legal path to migration. Student visa is the most conversible. You can go, apply for work visa upon your graduation, upon your obtaining employment certificate. There are two kinds of visas, two kinds of ways. One is actually just based on your human capital. You can apply for employment visa, and sometimes or a period to look for work. This is true in Japan, in Germany, and in, for example, Australia. So as long as you have this higher degree, you actually are allowed to stay at least looking for jobs. And then in all these countries, as long as you get employment, because the skill migration is really employer based. And so as long as the employer sponsors your visa, then you can stay. In fact, Japan, because of the labor shortage, because the government's aggressive kind of policy to retain students, Japan actually recently has increased the retention rate of international students. The last figure I saw is 45% of international students have actually stayed in Japan. And the government wants to retain at least 50%. So we really see the legal path to settlement is quite high. And also you have a lot of point systems to shorten the permanent residency requirements. So I think international students in that sense is seen as potentially highly skilled workers, and are the human resources the states want to retain. So the legal path is quite easy. It's much easier than the US, honestly. Outside of the US, it's very, very easy. I think the Germany and at least the Japan and Australia, I think, are easier.
Yeah, in the US, it's also relatively easy for students to change their visa as long as they get jobs.
Right.
Yeah, and then getting jobs, getting that H-1B visa is a path to permanent residency.
Right.
But then in the US, for some countries like China and India, the Philippines, then, from an H-1B to a PR requires a long waiting time because there are so many people in queue. Yeah.
Yeah, that in Japan is very short.
Okay.
And
yeah.
in Japan, well, it depends, it's 10 years legally, but if you're highly skilled and you have qualified these points, it could be 3 years. So for a lot of graduate students, for example, enter good companies, after 3 years, they can apply for permanent residency. So I think this all the kind of, the situation of demographic crisis has made these sort of legal paths much easier.
Yeah. But I would argue 3 years is also a long time. But anyway, so let's get to some of the audience questions.
3 years is a residency permit, it's not an application. So as long as you start working for 3 years later, you can actually apply for permanent residency. I guess the different countries are different.
Yeah. Okay. So here is a question from Caitlin. Why are East Asian countries so unwilling to open more channels of immigration through labor and instead use alternative pipelines such as international education?
That's a very keen observation. East Asian countries, I think, such as Japan or Korea, in particular, what they do, and they have started importing labor, and even so-called specified skilled workers, or middle skilled workers, manual labor, but they see them mostly as a temporary. But a country like Japan, for the longest time, didn't. And it's very importantly because, as I actually described in my book, it's a very ethno-nationalist kind of mentality. They do not see immigrants as like somehow is easy to be integrated into their society, and also oftentimes see immigrants as a potential threat to their cultural identity. So, and on the other hand, highly skilled migrants, they have more confidence that they somehow will fit in better. So oftentimes it's kind of a class-based discrimination as well, but it has to do with this ethno-national identity as well. But international students, they feel that they're potentially highly skilled workers, and also by learning a language, they have an easier maybe time to be integrated. So this is why international education has been much more tolerant or more encouraged than migrant workers migration.
Yeah, thank you. Here is another one from, I guess, another one from my student, from Ashika. She said, based on your article we read in class this week, that's your article with Tran, along with the article last week on Japan's closed door or side door policy, that's a lecture by Erin Chong from Johns Hopkins University. Would you say Japan is an opportunist country?
That's a good question, because I do not exactly know what the opportunist country entails. Maybe they just try to kind of, take the benefit, not wanting to kind of take the responsibility, kind of try to be very capitalistic about this. But what I see is in my own book, actually, I mostly focus on Japan. I would not actually call it opportunist country. I think the biggest reluctance really comes from as a sense of who the nation, what Japan is, and it's because Japan had been a sakoku place, and the closed country kind of place, and a post-war Japan also tried to reinstitute this image of a mono ethnic country. So it's really a big political issue for Japan to open the country. So it's not necessarily opportunistic country, but in fact, by allowing only temporary labor and try to use students as kind of a disposable labor, it does make this sort of migration regime exploitive.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, we have 3-4 minutes left, and then let me collapse 2 questions, and then you can address them. So one of the question is from Lauren. She said, as someone who is planning to go abroad for graduate education, your seminar was very informative and interesting. My question is, though it is in most situations beneficial for international students to have the option to work part-time, do you see this plan of the migration channel and education channel becoming an issue in the future, how do you think this could negatively impact future generations of students? So that's one question. And the other question is something that I'm interested too, is from Nurali, another of my students. Why Vietnamese students increase so fast from 2013 on?
Okay, and these are great questions. So first of all, about this kind of a dual identity of a student and workers, I actually do think working is not bad for international education. It's a way. Is the one way to be exposed to the society, to have a real experiences. And in my own research about Chinese students in Japan, they pick up language much more quickly than students who don't have that experience. So I think it's really a very important, valuable experience to be exposed to the society and the culture. And you learn a lot, like work ethics, a lot of things that will be your cultural capital. However, there is always a degree of how much you work and what's your priority. And for a lot of students, if you rely on work for the tuition, for living, you work 60 hours a week, then it's illegal, and also you don't even have time to study, right? So it jeopardizes your education future. So it's really about the degree and moderation as anything. So I think allowing students to work is great, and as US should probably allow students to participate in the off-campus labor market as well, because it's a great way to understand society. And I don't see this itself as negative, but when it becomes a way of making cash, then it becomes negative. So students probably need to think about the financial support and different things involved in international education. Okay, and I hope this answers the question. And so why Vietnamese students increase so fast from 2013? So everybody remember, if you know about Japan, 2011, we had a very big earthquake. And that really kind of reduced a lot of students from China and Korea. China and Korea were the traditional sending countries of language students. So, and also in 2012, what happened between China and Japan was China's demonstration. There was this huge dispute over Diaoyu Dao or Senkaku Island, political dispute. There was a huge demonstration in China against Japanese government, and the international relations were really, really poor, and the Japanese companies pulled out of China a lot of companies in 2012. So you can see the sort of natural disaster and plus international relations, plus actually gradually relative standing of China and Japan in terms of economic performances affect students' orientation about where to study. And other language schools used to depend on Chinese Korean students, so they had to look for new sources. So language schools are a very important part of migration industry. So they ally with those people in Vietnam, Vietnamese students themselves. Oftentimes, education brokers are students themselves previously, and they went there aggressively recruit students. That's why I showed the very, very central role of migration broker, the migration industry in facilitating student mobility, and this is particularly salient in the Vietnamese students' case.
Well, thank you very much. We have a lot more questions than we have time to address, but I will record those questions and I will discuss it in my class as well. And so since our time is up, we have to stop from here. And let's thank Professor Farah for this excellent, very informative, very intellectually stimulating lecture. And also, I hope that you would watch out for our center's website for future events. We have another public webinar that is connected to our class in week 6, like 2 weeks from now, by more on domestic workers in Southeast Asia. So thank you.